Doomberg, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start with your high-level assessment of the world energy situation. What has your attention most right now?
On the flip side, the East Coast had a cold snap, and the grid in New England wobbled quite a bit, and there's also some troubles in Texas. And it goes to show you that cold snaps that would be typically characterized as winter in the Northeast now are really sort of 24-hour major events on the Weather Channel because of the consequences and just how close those grids came to collapsing, frankly. And at one point in New England, which is a stat that just boggles the mind, some 40% of the electricity being produced in the New England network was being produced by the combustion of oil. Sort of back to the future again here, using dirty oil to make electricity. And so that's the big trend right now in the next weeks and months is will the warm weather in Europe hold, and will Europe get through to the springtime where they'll have to rebuild inventories once again heading into next winter, which will be the real test. But that's where we are today in the energy markets. It's all about the weather.
Sounds like they haven't had to take those type of drastic measures because the weather's been so unseasonably mild. I mean, is this just almost sort of like, the hand of God coming down and just a Deus ex machina sort of saving of the folks from Europe here? Or were maybe the expectations I mentioned a little too dire going in?
Well, let's take a step back and look what happened. First of all, the Germans and the Europeans in general, set about the task of buying every BTU of energy, regardless of carbon footprint or price paid. And so during key times in December, when the weather was sort of on average, as opposed to the warm spell that we've got now, the German grid was among the dirtiest in the developed world. It was burning coal as its major primary source of fuel. What happened in Germany, of course, is during the winter, they have these doldrums, and the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And so the grid at key points during December was really just amazingly carbon intense, burning coal at record speed. The speed with which they were able to bring back online old coal plants is really phenomenal, and congratulations to them. But also, Adam, in addition to that, they spent almost $500 billion on this effort. And as we said in our piece, that $500 billion could have bought them a generation's worth of state-of-the-art nuclear power plants with plenty of money to spare. And instead, it was basically squandered on 1 year's worth of oil, natural gas, and coal.
Part of what happened to Germany is they started decommissioning their nuclear fleet in favor of these alternative energy sources like wind and solar that A, are intermittent, B, cannot generate as much of the output as the nuclear fleet could. And you're basically saying what they have just had to spend in scrambling on dirty energy, which they didn't want in the first place, well, they could have invested that. Granted, it would have taken more time, but they could have invested that in completely upgrading a brand new nuclear fleet and basically had, zero emission, much more stable, dependable energy sources going forward. But now they're potentially caught in this cycle here where, every time the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, they're going to return to much more dirtier forms of energy.
For a nuclear reactor, one of the reasons why they're so fantastic is if you run them correctly, like the Germans and the Americans do, you can run your nuclear power plants at a 92, 93% capacity factor. So for most of the time, it's producing steady baseload predictable power, and the 7% offline time is for planned maintenance and scheduled. And it's very rare that you would see the nuclear reactor unexpectedly go offline. Conversely, with solar, of course, the sun doesn't shine at night, and the sun isn't very intense in Germany to begin with, and certainly not during the winter doldrums, as we just described earlier. Integrated over the entire year, the solar capacity factor for Germany is 11%. Now, it's in the U.S., for example, in California and Florida and Arizona and Texas, where the sun is intense and it shines a lot. The best run commercial solar fields have a capacity factor approaching 30%.
First off, the $35 for natural gas, while elevated by 7 times from sort of its historic average. Just to be clear, that has come down a fair amount from the crazy spikes we saw earlier, right?
Yeah, it peaked out at 100, and I'm just pulling it up right now. It's actually down to 27, so that's well off the highs. The historical average for LNG is a lot higher than it is for the $5 number I was quoting you. That's sort of pipeline natural gas at Henry Hub in the U.S. LNG historically was probably closer to the teens, $15 per million BTU, because there's substantial shipping, shipping costs. Well, the whole process of first chilling, then shipping, then regasifying, each step comes with an expense. And to the question at hand, which is trends in 2023 and beyond in the energy markets, I think one of the major mega trends, which is something we detailed for our Pro Tier subscribers in our year in review talk a couple of weeks ago, is the continued harmonization of the natural gas markets. I mean, ultimately, as this wave of LNG import and export terminal construction comes to completion, we're going to see global natural gas prices, and I believe global energy prices in general, harmonize to a pretty thin band, where the width of that band is the cost of shipping natural gas around the world.
Yeah, I mean, so for those of us that sort of continuously harp on the dangers of short-sighted or nearsighted energy policy, this is a classic example why, right? It's because it's the unintended consequences that more often than should result from nearsighted government policy. And to your point, the whole intent here behind this was to move to a greener global energy system. And as you said, we're actually making it more brown in this process.
Yeah, and everywhere it's tried, this is what happens. So look at New England, as we mentioned. They too have been on a mission to shut down their nuclear reactors, basically running the European energy playbook. And as we mentioned in the piece, they were a little less lucky with the weather in late December. It's something I'm sure you're personally familiar with, and many who live in the Midwest and the East Coast and the Deep South experienced a freeze of historic proportions. At least for the Deep South, this was a multi-sigma move. For Boston, what's the excuse, right? In Boston, this is just weather. But in Boston, in New England, again, as we mentioned, they were burning oil for 40% of their electricity production at the apex of the snap. And luckily, again, in New England, the weather has since turned for the better, and a warm spout has replaced the cold snap. As the weather does, it shifts, it cycles. And so the concept of burning oil in a modern, it just blows the mind that 40% of electricity in the ISO network in New England was coming from burning of dirty oil. And
right, it's totally unnecessary. And sorry to interrupt you, but yeah. In your answer here, you have written a lot on your Substack about how New England or the Northeast is very rich in natural gas, but it's very poorly infrastructured to actually use that natural gas, right? Which hence is why it has to rely on oil and pinches like this.
The amount of natural gas stored, or what the weather is going to do, is of minimal consequence to us when we're thinking about energy security, whereas it's a crisis in New England today, which is really just unacceptable. And so back to our expected value calculation, there's going to come a point where we are going to see rolling blackouts in the Northeast at the worst possible time, when residents need heat to keep their homes, operating normally. And it's just a matter of time. And it's rather unfortunate. And, in the Northeast, basically many of the homes are heated with diesel fuel, and now we have a diesel shortage. And we're just rolling from one near miss to the next. And unfortunately, we suspect and anticipate and bemoan the fact that eventually we're going to have snake eyes come up when we roll the dice, and it's going to be suddenly a scandal that everybody finds unacceptable. And it's frustrating to see, but it is what it is.